Well, greetings, everyone. It is time for our seventh installment of our Sunday School Snippets working through the book of Micah. And today we're going to begin chapter 6 of Micah. And we're going to take a look at it in two chunks. We're going to look at the first few verses and just make a couple quick points about that. And then we'll focus on verses 6 through 8, very famous in Micah, a very famous theme, really, in the book of the or in the entirety of the Old Testament, and a theme that shows up on the lips of Jesus as well, related to sacrifice versus mercy and so forth. So I'm going to put the text on the screen, make a few comments about it as we read it, and we'll go from there. All right, so here we go. Micah 6, 1 through 4. Arise, plead your case before the mountains, and let the hills hear your voice. Hear, you mountains, the indictment of the Lord, and you enduring foundations of the earth. The Lord has an indictment against his people, and he will contend with Israel. Let me just pause right there. If you've been following along that idea that the Lord has an indictment with his people, that has now become very clear. In the first 5 chapters of Micah, the Lord has spoken quite severely to his people in pronouncing the judgment of exile, indicting them for their hollow religiosity, indicting them for bad leadership, and a whole bunch of other issues. But in this particular passage, as we see in verse 3, there's an even more sort of specific point that God is making through Micah. "O my people," this is the indictment that God makes, "what have I done to you? How have I wearied you?" God is here asking, why do you keep turning away from me? Have I not done enough for you? In other words, answer me. The notice here's the real point. "For I brought you up from the land of Egypt and redeemed you from the house of slavery, and I sent before you Moses and Aaron and Miriam." As is so often the case in the Old Testament, God reminds his people of his saving work for them. The Exodus, this salvation of the people of Israel from the oppression they were in, the darkness they were in Egypt, is the sort of consummate, the consummate saving event, so to speak, of the Old Testament. And God is saying, look, don't you remember what I've done for you? And so often, I think in times of trouble, when we feel the displeasure of God, it's easy to forget everything that he's done for us. And perhaps this has been a good series of weeks for us all to reflect in the sort of doom and gloom around us, to reflect on what God has done for you individually, both salvation-related things as well as just provision for you, getting over illnesses or financial provision, caring for you in times of depression, sort of bringing you out of that, or perhaps just being present with you when you're struggling, maybe not rescuing you perhaps, but being present with you. And so the first few verses here remind us how we need to so often remember what God has already done. Not to look to the side and see, okay, what is he doing for that person over there, that family down the street, but what has he already done for me? And to reflect on that very, very important truth. Now we're going to look at the next section. So I'm going to put it back on the screen. We'll take a look at the next few verses. Very interesting. Let's read it for us. Micah 6, 6 through 8. "With what shall I come before the Lord and bow myself before God on high? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams and 10,000s of rivers of oil? Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul?" It's a big question that Micah is asking, sort of pretending to be an Israelite here, or sort of putting himself in the position of an Israelite. What can I do to please God if he's so angry with us? Can I just pile up mountains upon mountains of goats and calves and lambs? Can I just bring thousands of rivers of oil to sacrifice to God and give him everything in the temple, sort of going through the motions of worship? And notice what Micah's answer is to himself, so to speak. "He, that is God, has told you, O man, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you? But it's not mountains upon mountains of animal carcasses, but it's this: to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God." Through Micah, God says, look, I'm not fundamentally interested in burning a bunch of animals and splattering the blood everywhere and bringing oil and grain and so forth. Even though he does command that in the Old Testament. That's not really what I'm about. What I'm really about is your heart. In fact, we've already seen this in Micah, when Micah indicts them for their false places of worship, going through the motions, their empty, vain religiousness, as opposed to a real heart that has been gripped by God. So verse 8 here is a very beautiful truth, where Micah says, look, it's not about the externals. What God wants is for you to walk humbly with him, to love his covenant faithfulness, his kindness, to do justice, to do mercy. And that may sound familiar. There's a handful of passages in the Old Testament, and they're echoed in the New Testament, where God makes a similar point. I've thrown an example here to the right, Psalm 51, verse 16. You will not delight in sacrifice, or I will give it. You will not be pleased with a burnt offering. Even though God commands these things, the psalmist here, David, says, look, that's not fundamentally what pleases you. You're not just interested in the animal. It's not like you love a good barbecue from Texas or something like that. What you're interested in, and what the real sacrifices are a broken spirit and a broken and contrite heart. What God really wants is your heart. This is reflected in Romans 12 as an example, where the true sacrifices for a follower of God aren't physical animals, but in the light of Christ in particular, it is a heart that is the sacrifice. A heart, our bodies are themselves the sacrifices that we make spiritually to God. But it's not just an Old Testament truth. Jesus himself makes this very point. Now, he doesn't quote Micah 6, but he quotes Hosea 6, which is worth reading, and it's a very similar text. Jesus says to his religious opponents, go and learn what this means. And in fact, he says sort of versions of this in other places. I desire mercy and not sacrifice, for I came not to call the righteous, but sinners. And again, that's a quotation of Hosea 6:6. So it's not just an Old Testament truth, but it's a New Testament reality that Jesus has brought to bear when he says, look, God is fundamentally not about the external aspects of religion. What he wants from us is a heart that overflows with mercy and with justice and with love, both for him and for neighbor. And so it's maybe surprising to see this in Micah. It's very easy to think that the Old Testament is all about going through the motions, sort of trying to earn your salvation somehow by doing enough sacrifices to please God. And certainly that's not a New Testament reality. We are clear on that in Romans and Galatians and the teaching of Jesus and elsewhere. But it's not really even an Old Testament truth either. Insofar as the Old Testament does hold out this expansive system of sacrifices and cleansings and anointings in the tabernacle and ultimately the temple, Hosea, David, Micah, in this passage, they all recognize the actual intent of what God is after. This crystallized really in what Jesus will call the chief commandment, which is articulated in the very famous Shema in Deuteronomy 6. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, or with all your strength, depending on the translation. That really what even Old Testament religion pre-Christ, and certainly New Testament religion post-Christ, is about, is a heart that loves the Lord. Yes, that should overflow in external acts, and that's fundamentally what the sacrificial system was about. But to the extent that the Israelites were turning sacrifices and offerings into the essence of what they do, and their hearts were far from God, if they thought that just going through the motions somehow would please God, God has a very strong warning for them that he's not interested in those things at all. If you're not actually bringing your heart to worship, if you're simply punching, checking the box, if you're going through the motions, he basically ignores that. He's not interested in that. That's consistent in Micah. It's what Jesus speaks as well. Jesus is not interested in the outwardly religious. What he wants is someone who is repentant in seeking him. So maybe encouraged by that reality today from Micah. We'll continue with the next snippet looking through the back half of Micah chapter 6. Take care.